Why don't you tell me about your computational social sciences projects? What are you doing? How are you trying to understand and re-understand economics?
What we're doing is we're taking very large data sets. A lot of those are from the web, obviously, around the relationships, connections between organizations, and trying to understand are there patterns? Are there patterns that are changing in the fundamental way that economics works? So we published a paper about 3 or 4 years ago, which looked at the dominance and diversity of linkage patterns on the web. And we looked at the ratio of the number of fully resolved URLs to domains. And we found that a smaller number of domains over time are capturing a larger share of the attention. So you can sort of measure attention through links in social media. So we looked at a decade of Twitter traffic, social media posts on Twitter, also Reddit, and we found that the link diversity, the long-term link diversity, is in decline. So um, we
Mm.
then investigate this in a bit more detail, and we realize that it's what I'd talked about a bit in my book, Online Gravity, which was published about 7 years ago in English, and um, it's been published in a few other languages since. And it's basically sort of suggesting it's this observation that technology has sort of fundamentally changed the way economics works.
So if I understand that, when we
Mm,
get more data as more things become available online,
mm,
that it also has the kind of like some way paradoxical effect of it also though also compresses and pulls people and attention towards also smaller zones, even though overall we have so that's on what impact does that have? That must change individuals' lives, sort of how
mm,
corporations work,
mm.
and then so what are the different kinds of effects and impacts of that kind of finding?
Yeah, yeah. Well, maybe we should just clarify what it is first. So, firstly,
Yeah.
the idea is that online gravity is this combination of network effects and a phenomena, as you're probably aware, Jack, known as increasing returns. So it means that the more people use certain types of services, the more value is added to the network and to the service itself. And in traditional economics, there's kind of like a built-in handbrake to monopoly or to market power, and that is decreasing returns. So you look at traditional industries like soft drink or cars, automobiles. You see that despite the brilliant minds of advertisers and the billions of dollars at stake, things like soft drink, you see this stability over almost a century, of market share between Pepsi and Coke. And what explains that in part is that um, for Coke to steal share from Pepsi, it becomes increasingly expensive, and there's diminishing returns in winning that market share. So you have these kind of built-in barriers to monopoly or oligopoly. Um, Whereas in the information space, it was recognised some time ago that that sort of flipped on its head, and that often you find that the more people, the greater market share people, a company gains in a space, the more beneficial it is to get more users, and the costs decrease and the benefits to the users grow. And so you see sort of strange things happening. So instead of first we first sort of saw this with the first generation of social media, with Friendster and then later MySpace, um, which Rupert Murdoch paid for over $500 million for as an acquisition, um, and it when he bought it, it was the number one social media company in the world, and not long after Facebook sort of took over. And you might sort of think intuitively, well, okay, so he's going to wind up with the Pepsi of social media, but it doesn't work out that way, as we all sort of know now. And so you end
Mm.
up with this idea of these giant organisations that dominate a niche, and then you end up with satellites or smaller niche players, but you don't end up with this dual planet sort of system that we're more familiar with in the offline world, and which is why the kind of investors, venture capitalists, and people who work in this space, they know this because they know that the winners who win big, and there's not really any second prizes. So we see, for example, in ride sharing, the dominance of Uber, in search, the dominance of Google, even in retail, an area you think would be impossible to put moats up to, the dominance of Amazon is absolutely phenomenal. So, so yeah, that's sort of the phenomena, I guess. And then I guess your question is, what does that mean? In terms of economics, there's actually a lot of benefits. I think that these are kind of like democratically elected monopolies in a way. I think the pendulum has kind of swung against tech now because people are sort of seeing big tech as being a threat, or you know, but there are a lot of benefits, and I think that we can see that there are
Yeah.
we
Okay. Well, I would like to jump in there and just
mm,
so because it kind of seems then that economics, there's a kind of fundamentally new kind of economics that
mm,
the laws of economics still apply, but there's a way in which the dynamics are so different and kind of unique when there's different kinds of scarcity and you have these network effects, and so you get these really dominant players. But I mean,
mm,
I'm then wondering, I mean, so you said actually that there could be some benefits. I mean, how? So you might have a dominant player like Amazon or Google, but how easy is it for them to be challenged, and does it just because they have a lot of power, and does that mean that they can manipulate, what are the dynamics, when we explore the fact that there are these dominant players, what does that
mm.
mean as an individual, and can they be challenged?
Yeah, well, I think they can be challenged, but generally my sense is that um, it's not so much that someone comes along and builds a rival service, because so in the old-fashioned way of sort of competition, the way we sort of imagine competition, there was a very late stage challenger to Google. I mean, the search market is still incredibly lucrative. Obviously it's one of the world's largest businesses, and there was a very well-funded startup called Cool, the Irish company, and they had a very late stage crack at the search market, and they may have had a much better search engine, but it was all over by then. And you can see even in things like with social, like you see Google's attempts to try and do social with Google Plus. I mean, they're not a company without significant resources or lots of smart people, but their attempt to try and challenge Facebook's dominance in that space was a total failure, and they closed it. So less known is also Facebook's attempts to crack the search market, but they did. And so I think there's this sort of sense that it is still very difficult for companies to challenge one another, even that that are in this sort of tech space. Um, and I would suggest that the main threat is that the obsolescence of platforms, or the idea of them, moving to a new sort of business model. So, in the same way that we see media forms, people still enjoy the theatre. People publish poetry, um, and watch television, even broadcast television. But it doesn't sort of play the same role of dominance that it did. Newspapers are still very influential, but they don't possibly have the same sway that they did, 2 decades ago. Um, and and so I think that's my sense is that what happens is that you have this continual. So I guess the main finding of this was that might be seen as being very pessimistic. We're seeing this inexorable um, rise of a small number of players dominating and a lack of diversity. But one of the other things we did find was that there's continual evolution from a functional point of view. So functional diversity is ever changing, and that it forces the frontier of competition to a useful space in a way. One has to differentiate on function. So you see things like um, social media is dominated by Facebook, but you see emergence in Snapchat. So this idea of ephemeral messaging, as a new sort of form,
Mm.
or there was a wave. There is still a need for highly secure social media, personal intercommunication, and um, so yeah, that's my sort of sense is
Yeah.
new forms always coming.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's like you can't actually challenge someone when they start doing one thing really well, and there's maybe network effects, and people don't have this kind of aversion to switching to that. But then you get like new niches being created. Okay, we can't compete there, but let's create something else. And you could argue that could benefit people if more goods are being created overall. What do you think though? I mean, about when there's just overall in the economy more and more of the money we're pouring into it is on these online kinds of goods, really kind of like fundamentally different. How does that change sort of how kind of like the one side is, for example, how actually valuable and like good for the kinds of like, is it good that we're consuming social media as like economic goods that's important use of our time,
Mm,
um, and how does that kind of change almost global economics
mm.
and sort of how the world functions? Yeah, what are the implications here?
Well, I think there's actually been a longer term trend that predates the internet where we've moved towards away from tangibles towards intangibles, and this idea of um, brands, um, intellectual property, and online services has been growing, over the last 2 decades. But even before that, if you look at the S&P, in the 1950s, the majority of the asset, the balance sheet of the largest companies in the world was all tangibles. It was buildings and real assets, and now the balance sheets of the largest companies is largely intangible. So I mean, I think there's definite benefits to that because it means that they're a lot more flexibility. It means that there's a lot of high value jobs because it's part of this kind of global knowledge economy. Um, and yeah, I mean it's certainly something that it's a world a world of ideas. I guess we're moving into more of a world of ideas as we have kind of automated a lot of the kind of more basic services and
Yeah, and it's interesting. And I guess once we kind of have the right amount of material kind of wealth, I mean, there's also like a limit to how much better you can make your material surroundings, or
mm,
and I suppose obviously a lot of the world also has a lot of like say catching up to do and to get it to a reasonable level of living standards. But there's also a way in which services, whether that's online or in person, the creation of value from other human beings and the ideas and what they create. I mean, it sounds inevitable, and it kind of sounds like maybe a good thing too. Um, it's interesting that there has that there would be this shift through history of okay, like we first get more material things, and then we can kind of shift towards
mm.
yeah ideas, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess it's part of a broader move towards specialization, isn't it? And larger groups interacting, on a bigger scale. I mean, the diversity of roles that we can enjoy in society now and exchange value is, much greater than it was. And it benefits people like you and I because, I mean, it means that the jobs on offer now are much more than just you know surf, king, or
Right.
or farmer. It wasn't that long
Yeah.
ago before pretty much most of the jobs on offer were agricultural. And certainly that's changed.
Yeah, and people's unique kind of abilities and intrinsic interests. I
Mm,
mean, on the one hand, like the Ricardian view of the more we specialize and becomes more efficient and more valuable, but it's also, yeah, you could argue it also allows individuals more to flourish, and like showcase what they kind of have. I wonder if we can. So we've been talking about the online, then the actual, the economy in the world, how that's changing. I wonder specifically in like the science of economics, how we
mm,
study the world when we kind of there's more data online.
mm,
Like we can talk about like at the present moment, there's a
mm,
a big tide of big data, machine learning, and
mm,
things. But
mm,
even if you like in talking to some economists at my university, like even like 80s through the 90s, like it was just
mm,
almost like increasingly and increasingly you would get more kinds of data, and
mm,
even like data that we like that seems so mundane and even like kind of simplistic now, it's just they
mm,
didn't have that data on exports or whatever, and
mm,
so
mm,
over
mm.
time the kinds of questions that economists have been able to answer has just really been shifting, and so we'd
Yeah.
love to kind of contextualize and understand what's going on today.
Yeah, I think it's a golden age for economics, really. I mean, we're seeing this move towards a sort of bottom-up approach, the credibility, revolution. We've seen Nobel Prizes in economics being given to people that are this sort of new data-driven sort of approach rather than a more top-down theoretical um, macroeconomic view. I mean, I don't have a hard line on either approach, but we're sort of bottom-up practitioners in the sense that we're obviously using large data sets and machine learning, and I think that you can see things that you couldn't see before, and it's sort of we're sort of catching up with the physical sciences. So, for example, um, one of the Nobel laureates in physics, Brian Schmidt, who ran the Australian National University in Australia, until recently won the Nobel Prize for his discovery that the universe the acceleration of the universe um, is expanding, or the evidence to show that the universe's expansion is accelerating. And when he did that, it was very early, relatively, um, from a computational point of view, but it was one of these first uses of computational astronomy and astrophysics, and I think you can look back at the literature over the last 10 years, and there's some incredible papers in this space emerging now where we're seeing, as you said, Jack, you can see things in new ways. I mean, one of the things that really attracts me is this idea that you can look across space and time in ways that you just couldn't before. So the idea that you can, the Google Books project, for example, has uncovered these incredible patterns over the last 400 years of, printed books, and there's been lots of studies and literature showing all sorts of really interesting effects. Like, for example, the idea that we're forgetting things more quickly, not just as individuals, but as a society. I don't know whether you've seen that study, or there's a variety of studies that came out of that Google Books work.
Right. It's funny. I haven't looked at that study, but like listening to some philosophers recently, they kind of talked about like people like Plato had the concern that when you start writing things down, you'd think that you'd remember things more because now you have it, written down and stored.
Mm,
But there's
mm,
also a way in which we can kind of like once we start offloading things onto like all this like paper and then eventually
mm,
digitally, it's sort of like, well, now since we can access it already easily, like why do we need to know it? And then there's a way in which all information having to be salient in our minds and having to
mm.
be stored through like verbal communication. There's a way in which it kind of, yeah, it's this kind of new strange way of consuming like information and knowledge that kind of goes on when you have so much of it.
Yeah, well, I think that
I
idea of remembering things is very important. Yeah, and yeah, go on.
it's Well, you talk because you talked there about like economics,
Mm,
or having more data about things, but it's also
mm,
interesting if you talked about some other, science, like for example, physics.
mm,
It's fascinating because just in general, having computational power, like you can
mm,
now like start running simulations.
mm,
Like I've talked to some like computational biologists, and
mm,
like there's a way in which you can learn about like in biology. We're trying to like say, okay, simulate it and or computational economics, and like especially given that we can like increasingly start assuming that the economy is kind of goes to an equilibrium and has like linearities. I mean, in some ways it kind of feels like we did that because that's what the mathematics allowed. We get
mm,
that from Newton. It's
mm,
like, well, that's the tools that we have.
mm,
But if you actually can simulate more complex things, you can kind of be like, well, I wonder what kind of more edge cases these complex systems could go to. It's Yeah. So there seems like kind of a whole range of new kinds of things you can study when you have new data, but also new kind of computational power.
absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, and obviously there's you can do firm level studies. We've done quite a lot of work in that space, um, as well as looking at individuals. Our most recent work was published last October with our colleagues at Oxford University. Is looking at the factors that drive. It's a multi-factor study looking at the factors that drive the success of startups, and we looked at a whole range of factors that are internal to the firm, factors that are external to the firm, and then the founders themselves, the founders' personalities, and that was kind of the novel piece because there's been quite a lot of literature looking at startups and what drives their success. Is it investment? Is it location? Is it the industry? Is it timing? And of course, it's all of these things. Um, but it turns out that there's one factor that trumps all of those, and that's the personality of the foundation team, and not just the personality features of the founders, but the combinations of the personalities of the founders we found to be the most predictive of success.
Yeah, this was like a fascinating paper. So, tell me about what you found, and from what I understand, the way you kind of got data on these personalities is now that we have all this data on like CEOs and stuff if they have like online presence and things, and so within all that information you can kind of like latently hidden there is you can kind of extract their personality, right? And so I'd like to hear about that too, like the difficulties and like the scope for measuring these kinds of things like personality from online data.
Yeah, yeah. So the starting point, we started about 5 years ago. We did a study. I was working at Australia's Science Agency, CSIRO, and we had a project to try and make the graduate employment outcomes better for Australian universities. Um, and we were experimenting with various services. So we had a matchmaking service for university students to find career-related internships while they were studying, because that's one of the factors we found from our research was one of the best things you can do to promote better graduate employment outcomes. Um, But one of the things on my mind was that there's something more than just skills and experience. I mean, a lot of the kind of labour market economics that focus on skills. You know, what skills does the economy need? Is there the right match of the need of skills and the kind of supply of skills? Um, but it struck me there was this other dimension, this sort of hidden dimension. So we started looking at personality, and I connected with Mikhail Kaczynski, who's at Stanford, one of the world's leaders in this personality inference, so using language to infer people's personalities computationally. And and his colleagues, he introduced me to the wonderful Peggy Kern, professor at Melbourne University, and I've been working with Peggy ever since. And we did this study, which was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences about 5 years ago now, and we showed that we looked at 100,000 people on Twitter in 3,000 different jobs, and we found that they had people in the same jobs had remarkably similar personality features. We started with computer scientists and tennis players. It was just sort of two groups to start with. Started with just all the people on GitHub, the most productive developers on GitHub, and then the world's top tennis pros, women and men, mainly because they were all very active on Twitter in those days. And when you're active on Twitter, that gives you enough sort of a corpus, if you like, of language. You need about 400 words, and then you can kind of accurately infer people's personality in the Big Five framework. So that means there's 5 dimensions, but there's also subdimensions. So it's a 30-dimensional framework. And for people who aren't familiar with this idea of what personality is, it's a way of, I sort of think about it as very much our operating system. So it's a way of sort of seeing the world. It's a preferred way of engaging with the world. There's no wrong or right way, you know, to there's no wrong or right answer. It's just that these tendencies we're born with and seem to stay with us for most of our lives. Um, and everyone
And
has individual. It defines the individual difference.
yeah, and before we, so it's interesting, like one that you would look at different occupations, and that people would have different personalities, which makes sense, but it's also funny that yeah, you can kind of like there is like these patterns there. But I'm just wondering, 400 words, it kind of seems like, really small. Like it's funny that you can capture so much sort of variation in people. Like how validated are these measures of personality when you like use data online? Like
Mm.
that's, yeah, is that surprising to you that you could be able to do
Well,
that?
I was incredulous, to be honest, at the beginning, Jack, and I was also a bit of a personality skeptic, like probably many of the listeners here will be. Um, and so, in terms of, well, firstly, is the whole framework valid? And the answer is it's valid in the sense, and the Big Five framework is the most popular amongst psychology researchers worldwide because of its predictive power. So it can predict all sorts of useful life events and outcomes and educational outcomes and so on. So and there is consistency throughout many people's lives too in terms of how they show up in these inventories or frameworks. Um, in terms of how accurate the computer-based personality inference is, remarkable. It's been shown by Kaczynski and others to be as accurate as spousal assessments and co-workers assessments. Um, and yeah, so it's kind of like it's an incredibly powerful thing, and it's surprising how little information you need given a big reference corpus. So this is kind of this idea of having a big background corpus of people for whom their personality and the
Mm.
linguistic connections you can then accurately infer.
Yeah,
And
well, it's fascinating. I mean, so I've gone.
I
Go
know
on.
you go.
Well, just one thing is like with personality, I've been thinking about it a lot recently because I'm
Mm,
actually thinking of like running some like behavioral economics sort of experiments on how people of different personalities make risky decisions and confidence based decisions,
Mm,
and it's you could say it's weird that such a small number of words can show your personality. But even like when I think about personality a lot, and
mm,
my own and like friends, like it's actually, if you're like tuned into it, you're like, actually you kind of quickly see that people have certain tendencies, and it's not to reduce it down. In fact, like it's fascinating to see how personality like interplays with like their specific like history and like their idiosyncrasies. But you also I've also been talking to cognitive scientists about personality, and from like a dynamical systems perspective, we kind of need to have, as you say, like an operating system, right? We
mm,
have to have some. We couldn't just be random and chaotic, We
mm,
have to have certain tendencies
mm,
as the people that we are, and
mm.
then that's why it would make kind of perfect sense that you see people in certain occupations and they tend to have certain personality types. So it'd be fascinating to tell me more about that, and then lead me into that, what you found with startups and the success of different personalities.
Yeah, so we took this further later. So we thought, well, let's move beyond occupations and traditional occupations. The startups are sort of a special kind of occupation, I guess. And we wanted to know, are startup founders different to successful employees? That was the first question. And we found that absolutely they are, from a personality point of view. So we got data on 6,000 successful startup entrepreneurs and another 6,000 successful employees in lots of different roles. And we found that you can train a machine language classifier or predictor that distinguishes the employees from the entrepreneurs with over 88% accuracy using personality data alone. So it's like you've got a kind of sea of people. The only information you've got about them is their personalities. You can sort the entrepreneurs from the employees very clearly on their personality. So we knew we were onto something. And then the second discovery was that there's not just one type of entrepreneurial personality or founder type, but there's six different types. And this is used. So we use data from Crunchbase, which is the world's leading data source for startups and startup investment. And we got data on about 30,000 entrepreneurs worldwide. And the thing about Crunchbase, it's got the success data associated with the companies, their investment history, various IPOs or public listings, acquisitions, mergers and acquisitions, that sort of thing, as well as when companies pivot or close. Um, and so we looked at the six different types of personality. So the six types, we gave it an acronym. It's FOLD, FOALED, which stands for fighter, operator, accomplisher, leader, engineer, and developer. And we found that there are kind of three. The six types are versions of three different types. So the hacker, the hipster, and the hustler, which is kind of like something that is known or talked about a lot in the startup community itself. That you need sort of three types of founders, and most people will be familiar with the idea of a hacker and a hustler. Someone who's more sort of people oriented, kind of the suit, often as it's called in advertising, which is the often the CEO associated with the CEO role, and then there's a sort of heavyweight tech person, the CTO, or and the hipster, is sort of stereotyped as being a kind of a bearded, jazz listening to sort of goatee beard type coffee connoisseur. But it's really, I think, it's a form of industry expert. I mean, that's how we see it in this context. It's someone who's kind of got usually some industry expertise that they're bringing to the mix, and and often we see these combinations are very successful versions of these combinations. And we found that
Sure.
certain combinations are 8 to 10 times more likely to be successful.
So that's like archetypally, we can look at the kind of general things people say about what fit you need of different kinds of founders, and you kind of do find that indeed there are certain combinations of personality types and like therefore kinds of people that do mesh well together.
Absolutely.
But then and you're saying that so, okay, so what are the and like what combinations like that didn't work so well, and what did, and like why did you think that happened?
I think we only looked at success, so we didn't really look at failure. That's another study yet to do. But the things that do work is complementarity. And I think so. This idea of diversity, and I think we're working on a piece now looking at team diversity. Broadly, what are the things that drive team? We know that diverse teams work and diversity works. Um, there's been a lot of research, obviously, in the literature about gender diversity, about other forms of diversity, age diversity, organizational diversity, in academic teams, for example. There's ethnic diversity, and so on, and um, all of them contribute to stronger teams. But in the startup context, we found that this personality diversity was a real driver. And one of the things we learned was that these two key archetypes, the hacker and the hustler, they're complementary. Their personality features. If you look at them on a graph, they one's obviously more introverted and one's more extroverted, but it's much more subtle and sophisticated than that. And they help each other. They strengthen each other. And I learned in some of the literature search, we found that the philosopher Schopenhauer had this idea in romantic attachments that people choose romantic partners often that are obviously have to have some common ground, but
Yeah.
people select mates on the basis of them having some complementary skills, complementary sort of outlooks
Yeah.
and strengths.
It's funny because I think personality is definitely like the kind of one of the a perfect thing to have diversity and complementarity in, because there are ways in which you can be too different, like in your like fundamental values or religious views, and like
Mm,
there's been some good economics on how like there's a way in which there can be too much diversity and that can cause
mm,
problems and a lack
mm,
of fit. But when you have
mm,
different personality types, like for me, I mean, especially as I study and think about it more, it's just kind of like beautiful. There's even like good evolutionary explanations for why you'd have different types, so like you can kind of see the synergies, and like so once you appreciate that people are kind of seeing and the world differently, and they have different like things they're good at and different things that the way they approach the world, then yeah, it kind of um whether it's in a relationship or like yeah a company, you kind of help each other's like downsides, but more than that as well, kind of mutually both kind of seeing different opportunities in like new ways. And with
absolutely.
like this hacker sort of archetype, so like imagine they're low and they're like high in introversion, and are they like maybe more conscientious or open, like is there, have you looked, how would their personality be characterized?
Yeah, yeah, they're very open. So openness is a key trait of hackers. Yeah, and openness is openness to experience. It means it can be in an intellectual domain, or it can be in a creative domain. Often with hackers, it's in an intellectual domain. Sometimes there's a correlation with
Yeah.
music. So many hackers are into music. There's also a disagreeableness to them. They tend to be, and hence that fighter sort of label, they tend to be quite
Mm.
argumentative, not willing to take direction. Um, One of the other facets within the openness dimension, and one of the key predictors of entrepreneurship in general, it's actually the key predictor, is adventurousness. And this is you can see this in some of the famous entrepreneurs like Richard Branson. He likes to do his adventure sports, ballooning, you know
Yeah.
rockets, that sort of thing. And then a lot of the entrepreneurs that I know too, do rally driving or mountain climbing or and so, but it's not just high risk. It's not just a risk thing. it's a preference for novelty. At the end of the day, this facet of adventurousness. Some people just prefer to do the same thing and to master it. They're a fan of mastery, and that tends to be athletes. Athletes need to do.
Mm.
You need to put in the hours, and you need to get really good at the shot. And if you're in tennis, um, and you're really good at it, you often enjoy that mastery. That idea of repetition. But
Mm.
computer people tend to
Yeah.
be the opposite. If they have to do something twice, they're gonna pull their hair out. So
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So yeah, like this hacker type, they'll be like more introverted and creative and open, but then they'll also be kind of like low in agreeableness of like as well. Like when they think they're right and they have an idea, like it's they're getting their way, and if someone's dumb and they don't understand it, they're gonna tell them. Very
yeah,
interesting.
uh,
I like the athlete too as well. I mean, just playing a bit more tennis recently. Like I haven't done it much, but it's very interesting. It's just the same thing again and again, but it's kind of awesome. Maybe I'm
yeah.
more swayed down that kind of obsessive type personality, but yeah.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because having been in computer science and I enjoyed tennis. That was, I think, what drove me to this idea of choosing the kind of software developers and the tennis players. And the thing that when we've got the first results, I just couldn't. I thought that was a mistake because um, the software developers were so similar to one another, and the tennis players were also so similar to one another, but they were totally different to each other. And
Yeah,
tennis
yeah, yeah,
players are very
yeah.
agreeable. They're fabulous dinner party guests, one imagines, because I think part of the idea of that it's also this willingness to be um, you know openness to root, routine. You don't have this insatiable quest for variety, which many tech people do. Also shared by scientists. Scientists are very similar to tech people, not surprisingly. They're also very disagreeable and insatiable quest for variety. And
Mm.
sometimes, I mean, you can
Um,
sort of see disagreeable works too. So, for example, medical specialists can be quite disagreeable. But I think sometimes being able to deliver difficult news, or if you're an academic, part of the job description is sort of basically finding errors in other people's um, you know theories and
yeah,
arguments and picking a fight as part of the
that are,
business.
yeah, yeah, finding where people are wrong. Um, do you think that if we can kind of better understand that certain people, like certain personality traits, kind of just fit different occupations? I mean, it seems that sometimes you could say in some way people naturally sort, but I mean, is
Mm.
there a way in which it can help individuals to like better understand? Okay, if I have this kind of personality, I should maybe opt for these kinds of careers over these other ones.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we've certainly thought a bit about this, and yes, there's. I think you're right that most people do sort to some degree, but there's also a lot of people I think who are not that self-aware, and I think also that for a very small number of people, these sort of insights could be transformative. They could really change their life because I think a lot of people probably are stuck in the wrong personality role, so for
Mm.
them, and for a variety of reasons, either they haven't had the opportunities, to explore other things, or they're just not aware of them, or people choose careers, unfortunately, I think largely on the basis of, economics, and family expectations and so on, and um, there's a drive towards certain types of professions, which you know, and it sort of masks the diversity of occupations that are out there. From a personality point of view, one of the good news things about this first study we did was we realised that you know we don't all have to be just this one type of person. When you're entering the career market, I think from leaving university, certainly when I was leaving university, I remember thinking that all employers wanted someone who looked a bit like a young investment banker, basically, and that was the kind of model that everyone was living up to. Myself, not so well, probably. And they want a salesy kind of extroverted, and we're taught this idea that this is what people want. But turns out there are a lot of jobs for disagreeable introverts, and most of them are high paid ones at Google, so um, it's quite refreshing, and there's more to it than that, obviously, too. There's a lot of other
Mm.
kind of dimensions.
Yeah, and to link it back to what we were talking about earlier, I mean, maybe if in the past when there's like a lot of factory work or a lot of farmers, I mean, maybe actually there are certain personality types that are just better, but there's a way in which if you can actually better understand what you uniquely bring to the table, then with a greater diversity of like economic goods and then therefore like occupations to fill those, it's kind of increasingly important to understand your personality.
Well, that's
So
right. Mm.
so this has been fascinating talking about this paper and your work here on personality. So just to kind of broaden our scope and pull things back,
Mm.
um, what do you think the future is? We can answer these kinds of questions now. We can look at
Mm.
personality. What will
Mm.
you be doing in the future
Mm.
using new kinds of data to answer different
Mm.
questions? How will things change?
Um, I'm really interested in history, so that's sort of one frontier we're kind of exploring is how do we, and some of the big questions, I think some of the research that interests me is there's some incredible research done, as I mentioned, using the Google Books corpus that looks at uh, what are the kind of broad trends, over the last century. There's one that was done by some researchers at Stanford, which looked at the relationship between the use of language and discrimination, racial discrimination, and also um, the rise in sort of gender diversity in the workplace, and how that kind of you can see that in the change in language, in patterns in books, and that kind of anticipates in some cases these social trends. Um, there was another study done more recently, which is a bit more unusual, and they did this principal component analysis on all the language over the last century in all the English language books published, and they found that the first principal component, I don't know how technical the listeners will be, but there's this idea of you can use machine learning to break down the the key variables that will be able to distinguish um, the features, if you like, of a data set, a corpus, and this can be a huge corpus of text, like all the books published, for example. So they found that the principal component, in other words, the key thing that distinguished language use over time, was a fairly trivial one. It was kind of like a temporal thing, something related to time. But the second biggest distinguishing variable was this really fascinating trend, which has changed, um, and it's the use of rationality. The authors dug into it and found that it was increasing use of rationality in language over the last century, up until about 1980, the mid 1980s, and then the trend reverses, and then we've had a decline in the use of rationality and an increase in the use of selfish pronouns. And the
Mm.
critics of this, some say that it's quite simply informalization of language. That there's a growing use of more informal language, and that it doesn't have really that much significance. Some others say that it's the end of the post-truth era. It's quite a significant shift in history, and
Yeah.
in a similar way, we've got a big study we're working on to try and explore and disentangle the age effects of generations. So we've got data on from a US academic, Dr. Johnson. It's the largest survey of personality data in the world. It's about data on about 700,000 people who have done the full the full 300 question personality inventory test over a number of decades. So this is like 30 years of data, And by looking at the personality of people in different generations but at the same age. So, one of the things about generation theory I think is often annoying is people use it very loosely and they're often talking about millennials this or boomers that, and they're really saying old people. Old people, these days are, you know, or
Mm.
young people, which is sort of like since the birth of time, people have been saying that. But if you really want to say something about the generation that's not really about their age, you need to disentangle those effects. And we've done a study that does this, and we're working with Jean Twenge, who's the world's leading authority in this. She's written a book called Generations, published by Simon and Schuster last year. Um, and it's really quite remarkable because when you disentangle age, there's not that much difference between generations, but there is some difference. And the remarkable difference is that we're seeing a decline in neuroticism. So, in other words, unwanted negative emotions that arise in the mind from boomers down to Gen X, down to millennials. So each generation's getting more and more emotionally stable. In other words, that's better.
Mm.
Um, but the Gen Z has been a reversal. So,
Mm.
um, this is the first time in decades, possibly even in a longer period, in a century, when this kind of trend has changed. So these are the sort of things that get me excited. This idea: can we see
Yeah.
these bigger picture sort of trends? What is it? What's driving this?
Yeah, and is this paper out on changes in personality like over time? Because you can look at generations.
No, no, that's a work in
It's not
progress.
out.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but hopefully
Okay.
we'll have that
Well,
out later this year. Yeah.
oh, please let me know. Well, yeah, we can. Yeah, interesting. So it's funny because like obviously you have to be careful in in like interpreting, say, how language changes over time,
Mm,
but like certainly like a lot of like hypotheses do think people look at like art in the past or
mm,
good I wonder how it will change history, and
mm,
again I don't think even just analyzing language, yeah, like what if like art history and things like this like radically can change as we can like more easily compare like different styles and just different ways we did things.
yeah.
Um, yeah. Is as you say the approach you said at the start, this kind of bottom up. Let's find let's see what patterns there are, and I like both. I mean, there's also I like some Austrian economists who kind of are a bit more staunch and say, hey, there are these theories of economics. What do you want about? Why do you need to find new patterns in
Mm,
economics? Like there's a way in which we can make a rational science, and there is a need for good theories because at a certain point you can keep coming up with hypotheses and finding new patterns, but like what are you how are you explaining and describing that? So there's a mix, but yeah, this has been fascinating to kind of understand this approach. So, any last words, and where can people find your work?
Thanks, Jack. Well, they can go to my website, which is onlinegravity.com, um, and I'm more than happy to speak with anyone who's interested in this sort of area. We collaborate with lots of people, academics and people in government and industry. So, yeah, no, it's been terrific speaking with you today, Jack. Thank you.
Mm, thank you.